history feels solid, tangible, a line you can trace backward from yourself to your parents, to your ancestors, to the ancient world, to hunter-gatherers, and beyond. We imagine human history as a continuous thread, a story without missing sentences, a timeline where events transition into one another with the steady rhythm of cause and effect. We imagine our ancestors learning slowly, generation by generation. We imagine steady progress. We imagine clarity. But there is a place where the thread snaps, a place where humanity's story simply goes silent. 8,200 years ago, something happened, something so severe, so disruptive, so globally catastrophic, that entire cultures vanished from the archaeological record. Within what appears to have been just a few generations, settlements were abandoned, technologies forgotten, trade networks dissolved, and human populations across 3 continents seemed to shrink or scatter. It is a hole in our prehistory so large that it doesn't feel like a missing page. It feels like a missing book. We call it the 8.2 kiloyear event, but that name is far too clinical for what actually happened. It reduces catastrophe to a number. It compresses generations of suffering into a sterile scientific term. It hides the terror that must have been felt by the people who lived through it. What if we stopped calling it an event and started calling it what it really is? A global memory gap, a silence, a wound in the human timeline that has never fully healed. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, we're going to step into that silence. We're going to walk into a world that was thriving, flourishing, and full of promise, and then suddenly was. A world erased by something so strange and so sudden that even modern science struggles to explain it. And we're going to ask the questions no one can answer. What happened to the people who lived through those dark years? Where did their knowledge go? What memories were lost? And what did humanity forget? Because here is the unsettling truth. Before the 8,200-year gap, humans were advancing, innovating, building, exploring. After the gap ends, many early societies seem to be starting over, as if something pressed a reset button on human civilization. So let's begin by picturing the world not as it is now, but as it was 10,000 years ago, a world standing on the edge of transformation. Before the silence, a humanity on the rise. Try to imagine the world just before the gap. The last ice age had ended. The glaciers were retreating. Sea levels weren't rising gradually. They were racing upward, swallowing coastlines, drowning ancient settlements that modern divers still haven't found. People everywhere were moving, exploring, adapting. Across Europe, small farming villages appeared simple but growing. In the Middle East, the first real cities were forming, complete with granaries, walls, shrines, and organized labor. In Africa, populations expanded along rivers and coastlines. In East Asia, pottery traditions blossomed. The Americas saw their own quiet revolutions in hunting and early cultivation. Humanity wasn't primitive. Humanity was accelerating. Populations grew, technologies spread, villages turned into towns, hunter-gatherer groups settled. The pace of innovation quickened. From all archaeological data, this was a time of rising complexity. And then, suddenly, the world plunged into cold. A winter with no warning. Around 8,200 years ago, temperatures across the northern hemisphere dropped. Not by a little, not by a seasonal fluctuation, by enough to devastate food systems, by enough to collapse ecosystems, by enough to shift rainfall across half the planet. And it didn't last a year, or 10 years, or even a century. This cold period lasted more than 300 years. For generations, children grew up in harsher winters than their parents had known. Crops failed unpredictably. Lakes and rivers dropped. Forests thinned. Grasslands vanished. Animals migrated or starved or went extinct. It was, quite literally, a slow-motion climate collapse. We don't know if humanity understood what was happening. Probably not. They had no written records, no scientific tools, no global network to compare experiences. A family in Anatolia wouldn't know that a family in France was suffering the same famine. A community in North Africa wouldn't know that the Tigris and Euphrates were drying. A village in the Indus Valley wouldn't know that rainfall had shifted away from the monsoon belt. People only knew their own world was breaking. Archaeology tells us the consequences were immediate and widespread. Villages abandoned, cultural traditions disrupted, technologies lost, trade routes severed, population centers emptied, and across the world, human progress stalls, sometimes revering entirely. This is the heart of the mystery. The sudden breakdown of promising early societies, all at once, across vast distances, without a unifying cause we can definitively prove. It is a global pause in human advancement, a pause that lasted longer than the entire golden age of Greece, longer than the Roman Empire, longer than most of recorded history. Think about that. An entire era of forgotten struggle stretching across centuries. The gap shows itself. When archaeologists dig into these layers of earth, they see something eerie. They see prosperity, innovation, stable villages, and then nothing. A sharp decline in artifacts, a drop in building structures, a reduction in trade goods, a loss of artistic complexity. The layers after the 8.2K event often look poorer, simpler, rougher than the ones before it, as if humanity had to start over. Some cultures never recovered. Some migrated. Some changed so radically they became unrecognizable to their descendants. Most left no trace of their suffering. This is why the 8,200-year gap feels like standing at the edge of a cliff in the archaeological record. On one side is growth. On the other side is silence, the strange calm of catastrophe. And yet, there is something strangely soothing about studying this forgotten era. Maybe because it reminds us that humanity has survived collapse before. Maybe because the ancient world endured centuries of hardship without losing their sense of purpose. Maybe because even after the silence ends, people eventually rebuild, reinvent, rediscover. There is no urgency here, no modern chaos, no noise, just the quiet patience of history waiting to be understood. So settle in. Let the mystery unfold slowly. In the next part, we will step deeper into the unknown and explore the scientific theories, real and speculative, about what triggered this global catastrophe and why so many civilizations never recovered. Before the 8,200-year gap, the world was healing. For thousands of years after the last ice age, Earth had been warming steadily. Forests expanded. Rivers swelled with meltwater. Animals migrated north. Humans thrived in the newly fertile landscapes. Imagine being alive then. Every generation saw the world become a little more generous, warmer springs, longer summers, richer soil. Life was predictable, hopeful, abundant. And then that hope froze. Not gradually, not naturally, not gently, but with the suddenness of a trap snapping shut. This is where the mystery deepens, because scientists believe they know how the planet plunged into cold, but not why it happened so suddenly, or why the consequences were so devastating. Tonight, we trace the chain reaction that plunged humanity into its greatest forgotten crisis. The lake that broke the world. At the end of the Ice Age, a massive lake covered parts of modern Canada and the northern United States. It was the size of all the Great Lakes combined, an inland sea trapped behind melting walls of ice. We call it Lake Agassiz Ojibwe. It held more water than every river on Earth. For centuries, the ice dam holding it back weakened. Then one day, perhaps in a single season, perhaps in a single week, perhaps in a single catastrophic moment, the dam failed and the lake emptied, not slowly like a river, not steadily like a glacier, but catastrophically. A flood roared into the North Atlantic, so large that it raised global sea levels by as much as 2 meters. Imagine that, 2 meters of water added to the oceans in a geological blink. This wasn't a flood like the ones we know. It was a flood the size of an ocean entering another ocean. It disrupted ocean currents that had been stable for thousands of years. And those currents, specifically the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, are Earth's natural heating system, carrying warm water from the equator to the poles. When that system faltered, the world shivered. Suddenly, sharply, fatally. This is the leading scientific theory for the 8.2K event. A megaflood so enormous, it changed the temperature of Earth. But even this explanation leaves haunting questions unanswered. Because the flood explains the cooling, but not the collapse within the collapse. When you look at the archaeological evidence, something becomes clear. The climate shock wasn't the only disaster happening. There were secondary collapses, some cultural, some ecological, some we still don't understand. In the Middle East, early farmers abandoned fields and returned to foraging. In Europe, settlements that had been inhabited for generations suddenly went empty. In Africa, lakes dried and nomadic groups scattered. In the Americas, population density drops at multiple sites simultaneously. The climate shifted, yes, but climate doesn't explain why certain technologies disappeared, why some pottery styles were never made again, why early villages abruptly burned without signs of attack, why burials change so dramatically, why genetic studies show population bottlenecks. Something else was unfolding, a global trauma we have no written memory of, a kind of prehistoric dark age. The archaeological red flag. One eerie pattern repeats across the world. Destruction without conflict. Buildings burned without weapons. Villages abandoned without struggle. Tools left behind as if dropped mid-use. Kilns unused for generations. Crops unharvested. It looks like fear, or famine, or disease, or something else entirely. The problem is, we have no narratives, no myths that can be traced with certainty, no ancient legends clearly describing this period. It's as if the event was so traumatic that cultures either forgot it or chose never to speak of it. The 8.2K gap is global but silent. Historians don't like silence. Archaeologists don't trust it. Human beings aren't built for it. But sometimes the most important chapters of our story are written not in words, but in absences. A wind that carried change. Consider this. Before the gap, there is beautifully made pottery across Europe and Anatolia. Sharp designs, consistent patterns, clear artistic traditions. After the gap, pottery becomes crude, uneven, simpler, as if the knowledge of how to make it properly disappeared. In the Middle East, early architecture, plastered walls, stone foundations, planned settlements gives way to temporary structures. Mud huts, impermanent shelters. This is the opposite of progress. It is regression, a forgetting, and for archaeologists, this is the most haunting part of the gap, not the climate data, not the sea level rise, but the evidence that humanity lost knowledge it had once mastered. Civilizations don't normally unlearn skills unless something forces them to, and that something lasted for centuries. The whispering winter. People who study this era often describe the climate shift as a cooling event. That phrasing is almost gentle, almost harmless. But imagine this instead. You are a parent in a warm, stable village. You look across fields that have fed your family for generations. You know the seasons. You trust the land. Then the sky changes. Winters sharpen. Summers shorten. Crops fail not once, not twice, but year after year. You have no explanations, no warning, no alternatives. You pack what you can and move. Hopping the next valley will be kinder. It is. Nothing is. People starve silently. Communities fracture quietly. Villages split apart. Languages drift and change as groups scatter. By the time the climate recovers centuries later, the world is culturally unrecognizable. Humanity didn't just endure a disaster. Humanity became someone else. The first memory loss in human history. The 8.2K gap is the closest thing we have to a prehistoric amnesia. Comparing genetic, archaeological, and paleoclimatic data reveals something astonishing. Large parts of humanity lost cultural memory simultaneously. The stories, rituals, technologies, and identities that existed before the event disappear from the earth. Just like the Bronze Age collapse thousands of years later, only slower, deeper, and more complete. The 8.2K gap didn't just cool the world, it erased a world. In the next part, we step into the heart of the mystery. Who were the lost cultures that vanished during the gap? And what clues remain of the world that existed before the silence? When you study the 8,200-year gap, the strangest part isn't the climate change. It isn't even the suddenness of the collapse. It's the people, millions of them, who vanish from the archaeological record as if the earth swallowed their history whole. Before the gap, humanity was branching into dozens of early cultures, each unique, each growing, each leaving evidence of innovation. Then the cold struck, and many of these cultures disappeared so completely that we only know them through scattered artifacts or abandoned ruins. Tonight, we're going to step into those lost worlds and walk through the fragments they left behind. Because these weren't primitive tribes. They were early civilizations in all but name, and their disappearance is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in human prehistory. 1. The forgotten builders of Anatolia. If you walked through central Turkey 9,000 years ago, you would find something extraordinary. Dense settlements, multi-room houses, neighborhoods carefully planned around courtyards and hearths, farming communities that had already mastered grains, weaving, and trade. One of the largest sites we know Seirnu was thriving before the gap. People here built stone structures, practiced metallurgy, and created architectural styles that wouldn't reappear for thousands of years. And then they're gone, not slowly, not over centuries. Abruptly, the settlement empty, the surrounding villages abandoned, the population evaporated. Archaeologists have no evidence of war, plague, or invasion. It's as if the entire region got up one morning and walked away without telling anyone why. The people of Anatolia left behind tools, figurines, half-finished buildings, and a silence so deep it stretches across the entire Middle East. What happened to them? No one knows, but their disappearance marks one of the earliest cultural breaks in human civilization. 2. The vanished farmers of the Fertile Crescent. This is the part that surprises most people. Farming didn't rise smoothly. It rose, flourished, and then almost died out before the 8.2K event. Early farmers in the Fertile Crescent were expanding rapidly. Villages grew, granaries multiplied, crops spread into Europe, Asia, and Africa. You would think farming, once discovered, would be permanent. But as the climate plunged into unpredictability, something unimaginable happened. Archaeological layers show farms abandoned, fields left fallow, tools unused, villagers returning to hunting and gathering. It's as if the world said, "This is not the time for agriculture," and humanity obeyed. Whole regions where farming had begun reverted to nomadic life for centuries. This is cultural collapse of the highest magnitude, comparable to losing literacy or architecture. Imagine if our modern world suddenly forgot how to grow food. That's the scale we're talking about. 3. The burned villages of early Europe. Across Central and Eastern Europe, archaeologists keep finding the same chilling pattern. Villages burned deliberately, but without signs of attack. The fires were hot, destructive, intentional. But where are the bodies? Where are the weapons? Where are the invaders? They don't exist. Instead, it looks like communities burned their own homes, maybe to purify, maybe to abandon, maybe out of desperation. Afterward, they moved, often hundreds of miles, and built simpler structures with less stability and fewer resources. These people didn't just migrate, they regressed. Europe's population declines dramatically after the event, and genetic studies show bottlenecks, meaning entire lineages were lost, not because of one tribe wiping out another, but because the world itself became a harder place to live. 4. The empty lakes of North Africa. In North Africa, something even stranger happens. Before the 8.2K gap, the Sahara wasn't a desert. It was a vast green savanna full of lakes, rivers, and animals. Humans thrived here as pastoralists, fishers, and early settlers. Then rainfall shifted, abruptly, severely, irreversibly. Lakes dried, rivers vanished. The green Sahara began turning into the desert we know today. Communities didn't die overnight. They moved, but here's the mystery. They moved without leaving traces. Whole pastoral cultures disappear from the archaeological record for centuries. No pottery, no campsites, no burial grounds, as if the people walked into the desert, and the desert erased them. By the time new cultures appear, they look different genetically, linguistically, and culturally. Somewhere beneath the shifting sands may lie the remains of a lost world that vanished during the 8.2K silence. We just haven't found it yet. 5. The lost traders of the North Atlantic. Imagine this: 6,000 years before the Vikings, 4,000 years before the Celts, people along the North Atlantic coast were already navigating waters, trading shells, minerals, and tools. Then, within a generation, maritime activity drops to near zero. No more long-distance movement, no more coastal settlements, no more exotic goods appearing far from their source. It's like someone flipped a switch. After the gap ends, maritime culture slowly reappears, but smaller, simpler, and scattered. Whatever knowledge they had, whatever routes they followed, whatever vessels they built, they vanish from memory during the centuries of cold. This early North Atlantic world is one of the most complete disappearances in human prehistory. 6. The frozen villages of the Americas. In both North and South America, archaeologists find disruptions at this exact period. Settlement patterns shift, burial practices change, pottery traditions vanish, population density drops. In some areas, people relocate to higher ground. In others, they move south. In many regions, they disappear for generations, replaced later by different groups. It's not total collapse, but it is massive cultural turnover, a global echo of the same silence. What all these disappearances have in common, for reasons we still don't fully understand, the 8.2K event caused population decline, cultural fragmentation, technological regression, migration on a global scale, memory loss across civilizations. The people didn't all die, but their cultures did. What survived was not identity, but only the threads carried by the survivors. When the world recovered, humanity didn't. Not fully, not for centuries. This is the heart of the 8,200-year gap, a global cultural erasure so complete that we can only piece it together through ruins, soil samples, and the ghostly shapes of ancient settlements. In the next part, we face the chilling question: why didn't these cultures return? What prevented recovery for generations? When the world finally stabilized, when the temperatures warmed, when the rains returned, when the seas calmed, you might expect humanity to rebound immediately, to rebuild the villages, to replant the fields, to revive the trade networks. But that is what happened. For reasons we still don't fully understand, humanity remained in a centuries-long stall, as though the collective momentum of our species had been broken. It is one of the strangest features of the 8.2K gap. The world recovered long before humanity did. Tonight, we explore the most haunting question of all: what prevented our ancestors from rebuilding? Because the archaeological record is clear. For almost 400 years, humanity stopped climbing forward. 1. The weight of generational trauma. Imagine how long 400 years truly is. It's longer than the time between the Crusades and now. It spans more than 15 human generations. It is enough time for a culture to rise, fall, be forgotten, and replaced. For the people living through the post-collapse era, survival, not innovation, was the priority. Generational trauma changes behavior. It makes societies conservative, cautious, slow to experiment. If your grandparents barely survived the cold, if your parents lived through famine, if you grew up hearing stories of hunger and fear, you don't gamble on new ideas. You cling to what works. You avoid risk. You maintain what little you have. And entire civilizations can freeze in place. In this light, the centuries of stagnation after the 8.2K event make chilling psychological sense. Humanity wasn't advancing. Humanity was afraid. To the great forgetting, knowledge is fragile. It survives only through constant use and teaching. When population drops, when families scatter, when elders die before passing on their skills, knowledge disappears faster than we expect. Archaeologists see this everywhere after the 8.2K event. Lost pottery techniques, lost architecture methods, lost hunting strategies, lost textile patterns, lost rituals, symbols, identities. Even farming, a breakthrough that should have transformed humanity forever, was temporarily abandoned in some regions. This is not just collapse. This is forgetting, a tearing of the threads that hold culture together. In many ways, the centuries after the event feel like a global amnesia. People remembered how to survive, but forgot how to build. They remembered how to hunt, but forgot how to settle. They remembered their families, but lost their civilization. Humanity itself became simpler, not because they lacked intelligence, but because complexity could no longer be afforded. 3. The land itself became hostile. Even after temperatures stabilized, landscapes changed permanently. The monsoon shifted south. The Sahara lost lakes and never regained them. Woodlands across Europe transformed into mixed forests. Animals moved to new grazing ranges. Plant species migrated hundreds of miles away. Humans cannot rebuild if the world they knew no longer exists. Land that once supported farming became barren. Hunting grounds dried up or refilled in unfamiliar ways. Villages built near rivers found those rivers gone. Pastoralists lost seasonal grasslands to encroaching desert. Humans had to relearn their environments from scratch. That alone could take generations. And it did. The new world was not worse, but it was different. And difference is disruption. 4. The endless migrations. When food becomes unpredictable, people move, and move, and move again. The centuries after the 8.2K event were a time of constant wandering. Families walked from valley to valley. Clans shifted territories. Nomads crossed regions they'd never seen before. Villages relocated repeatedly. Populations mixed and remixed. This mixing is why genetic signatures change so dramatically during this era. But migrations also slow cultural recovery. Stability builds innovation. Restlessness prevents it. You cannot build monumental structures if you move every few years. You cannot preserve pottery styles if you abandon your kilns. You cannot train apprentices if communities disperse. You cannot maintain agricultural surplus if fields aren't permanent. The world became a vast, drifting mosaic of displaced humanity, a mosaic with no anchor. 5. Conflict without civilization. There is something chilling about the violence of this period. Not organized warfare, not battles, not armies. Those require surplus, leadership, and infrastructure. What we see instead is small-scale raids, territorial skirmishes, resource conflicts, family feuds, acts of desperation. This kind of violence fractures culture, but does not produce the empires or political structures that would rebuild it. People fought, but without the capacity to conquer, unite, or create anything lasting. It is a violence of exhaustion, a violence of scarcity, a violence that drains societies rather than reorganizing them. This kept humanity locked in the collapse. 6. The silence of trade. Trade is the nervous system of civilization. It moves ideas, technologies, and goods. It spreads innovation like electricity. Before the gap, trade flourished. After the gap, it flatlined. There was no one to sail long routes, no one to maintain distant alliances, no safe roads, no surplus goods, no reliable weather patterns for navigation, no excess labor. Trade didn't just decline. In many regions, it stopped. And when trade dies, cultures turn inward. Languages evolve separately. Technologies diverge. Villages grow isolated. Cultural memory becomes local, not global. It is the opposite of civilization. 7. A world too young to remember. Why didn't humanity preserve stories of this catastrophe? Why aren't there myths, like the ones we have about the flood or ice age, that describe the 8.2K silence? The reason is heartbreaking, because the cultures that experienced the collapse didn't have writing, and the cultures that survived it were too fragmented to preserve long-term oral traditions. Only later societies developed rich mythologies, but the memories of this global trauma had already faded into nothing. By the time humans built the first dynasties of Egypt, by the time Mesopotamia began writing on clay tablets, by the time ancient China formed its early states, the 8.2K event was already thousands of years in the past, forgotten by everyone, except the ruins, except the abandoned settlements, except the sudden dark layers in the soil, except the genetic echoes scattered across continents, except the stories we can infer from silence. The longest recovery in human history. Even when the climate warmed again, humanity remained culturally fragile, fragmented, and cautious. It took centuries, generations of rebuilding, relearning, reimagining, before society found its momentum again. This is why the 8.2K gap is so chilling. It shows how thin the fabric of civilization truly is, and how easily it can unravel In the next part, we ask the most unsettling question yet. What if the 8.2K event wasn't just climate? What if something else, something still hidden, helped erase those early cultures? Because the evidence suggests the collapse has dimensions we have not yet fully uncovered. When people talk about the 8,200-year gap, they almost always focus on the climate. The megaflood, the cooling, the droughts. And yes, the climate shock was real, severe, and global. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Climate alone does not explain the collapse. Too many patterns are left unexplained. Too many anomalies, coincidences, and cultural breaks happen at the exact same moment in history. Archaeologists rarely say it openly, but many suspect the same thing. Something else was happening, something beyond weather, something that pushed fragile early societies past their limits. Tonight, we explore the hidden forces, ecological, biological, geological, and possibly cosmic, that may have shaped the 8.2K collapse, and why so many clues are missing. 1. The volcanoes no one talks about. Most people don't know that around the time of the 8.2K event, several major volcanic eruptions occurred across the northern hemisphere. Not one, not two, but multiple. These eruptions didn't destroy civilizations the way later eruptions like Thera or Tambora did, but they may have contributed to a world already destabilized by cooling. Volcanic ash can block sunlight, destroy crops, alter rainfall, trigger temperature drops, poison water sources. Now imagine this layered on top of a global cooling event already underway. A world struggling to produce food suddenly becomes a world fighting for survival. The eruptions are not fully linked to the climate change, but their timing is suspicious, and the archaeological record around these eruptions shows settlement decline, population movement, and food shortages. The climate may have been the spark. Volcanoes may have been the accelerant. 2. A pandemic lost to time. Disease does not preserve well in the archaeological record. Ancient pandemics often vanish without leaving bones or DNA behind, but some patterns look eerily familiar. Rapid population decline, abandoned settlements, mass migration, genetic bottlenecks. These are the fingerprints of a pandemic. Before the 8.2K gap, the world was becoming more connected. Trade, migration, animal domestication. Where there is movement and domestication, there is disease. Here's the haunting part. This was the moment when humans and animals began living in close quarters for the first time. Packed villages, shared water, stored grain, domesticated cattle and goats, a perfect breeding ground for pathogens. Some scientists believe a prehistoric plague may have swept through early settlements so long before writing that no story survived. It wouldn't have to kill everyone. It only needed to destabilize societies already weakened by climate stress. Disease collapses trust. It stops trade. It reduces knowledge transfer. It terrifies communities. If a pandemic struck during the 8.2K cooling, it could explain why recovery took so long. It could also explain why cultural continuity broke, why skills, languages, and traditions vanished. A disease severe enough to kill knowledge. Not humanity, but memory. 3. The hidden floods beneath the flood. The mega flood from Lake Agassiz is the headline event. But beneath that are dozens of smaller regional floods caused by melting ice and shifting rain belts. Coastal settlements drowned, riverbank villages washed away, valleys flooded unpredictably. And here is the critical part. The earliest human settlements were built near water. Always. Rivers, lakes, coasts, this is where humanity lived. Which means this is exactly where the flooding hit. Archaeologists suspect many early communities, especially those made of wood, mud, or reeds, simply vanished beneath rising water. Not destroyed, not burned, not abandoned, just submerged, lost beneath lakes, deltas, and coastlines that no longer match ancient geography. We cannot excavate what lies underwater without massive resources, and most early sites leave no stone foundations. Entire cultures may lie hidden beneath rivers and seas we assume are natural. The silence in the record is not absence. It may simply be drowning. 4. The collapse of navigation. This is the most overlooked clue. Before the 8.2K gap, humans were already navigating rivers, lakes, and coastlines with surprising skill. Then the climate shifted. Storms became unpredictable. Currents changed. Flooding altered coastlines. Wind patterns moved. Navigation collapsed. When a society loses the ability to move safely over water, trade stops, knowledge stops, exploration stops, cultural exchange stops. A world that was connecting suddenly becomes a world that is isolating. The collapse of navigation is invisible in archaeology, but its consequences are not. This may be why maritime cultures vanished so completely, why shell beads disappear from inland sites, why exotic minerals stop moving, why coastal settlements shrink. Humanity became landlocked, cut off from one another. Isolation is cultural death. 5. The Great Starvation. The 8.2K event caused crop failures around the world, but the starvation it triggered was not a single famine. It was a long, drawn-out, generational struggle. The archaeological evidence is heartbreaking. Shorter life expectancy, signs of malnutrition in bones, reduced child burials, suggesting lowered birth rates, fewer tools, less artistic expression, simpler housing, heavier reliance on wild plants. Starvation does more than weaken bodies. It weakens culture. Art disappears. Craftsmanship declines. Tools become basic. Architecture becomes temporary. Trade dies, communities break down. People who are hungry don't build, they survive. For centuries, humanity lived in survival mode. It explains why the gap is so silent. 6. The cosmic question. This is the theory archaeologists avoid, not because it's impossible, but because it can't be proven. A cosmic event, not an extinction-level asteroid, not a crater-forming impact, but something smaller, a comet fragment, a meteor airburst, a cosmic dust event that dimmed sunlight. Events like this are known from later periods. Tunguska in 1908, for example, and they leave almost no long-term evidence. Some researchers believe a cosmic event could have added stress to an already collapsing system, triggering forest fires, regional warming or cooling, shock waves, atmospheric changes, localized devastation. It's speculative, but the timing of certain charcoal layers and soil disruptions is suspiciously close to the onset of the gap. Perhaps the climate crisis was natural, and something else pushed humanity over the edge. 7. The mystery of the missing stories. Here is the strangest part of all. Cultures all over the world have myths about floods, fire, darkness, or wandering years, but none can be reliably dated to the 8.2K event. Why? Because the cultures that suffered the most weren't yet writing, weren't stable enough to preserve oral epic traditions, weren't connected enough to share memories across regions. It's not that the people didn't tell stories. It's that their descendants forgot them. Their world died. Their memories died with it. This is why the gap feels like a wound. The 8.2K collapse didn't just erase cultures. It erased witnesses. Behind the silence is a hidden story. When you add all these forces together, climate collapse, volcanic ash, possible pandemics, flooded settlements, navigation failure, crop failure, starvation, mass migration, memory loss, possible cosmic activity, you get a picture of a world overwhelmed by crisis. Not one big disaster, but many small ones, layered until humanity broke. The silence, then, is not mysterious. It is tragic, a global thundering quiet, created by 1,000 unseen pressures. In the next part, we explore what came after the silence, how humanity rebuilt, how new cultures rose from the ashes, and why the world that emerged was fundamentally different from the world that vanished. When the 8.2K gap finally ended, humanity did not simply resume where it had left off. The world had changed. The survivors had changed. And the knowledge that had vanished could not simply be recovered. The recovery was slow, fragile, messy, but it laid the foundations for the civilizations we know today. In this part, we step into the early post-gap world and see how human societies clawed their way back from silence. 1. The first steps to rebuilding. In the aftermath of the gap, survivors returned to the abandoned lands, but they did not return as they had left. Villages were smaller, simpler, and scattered. People relied on trial and error to rediscover agricultural methods that had been forgotten. In Anatolia, for example, settlements like Seyrnu and Hasseler were rebuilt, but smaller, less complex, with simpler layouts. Pottery styles had regressed. Tools were rudimentary. Yet slowly, innovation returned. Grain cultivation resumed. Domesticated animals spread again. Communities began to stabilize. It was a cautious rebirth. No one dared to build large cities or centralized states too quickly. They had learned the consequences of overextending in a fragile world. 2. Agriculture returns slowly but surely. Across the Fertile Crescent, humans experimented with crops. They relearned irrigation. They cultivated wheat, barley, and legumes. But it took generations to fully regain what had been lost. The key to recovery was resilience, not innovation. Communities survived by adapting to microclimates, diversifying food sources, and forming small, tight-knit groups. Knowledge was passed orally, generation by generation. Written records would not appear for thousands of years, so survival depended on memory, storytelling, and practical experience. In Europe, farmers rediscovered techniques for planting in marginal lands, while in Africa, pastoralists adapted herding practices to changing rainfall patterns. Civilizations were being rebuilt, but they were different, simpler, smaller, and more cautious. 3. Reconnection and the return of trade. One of the slowest processes in this recovery was the re-establishment of trade networks. During the gap, exchange of goods, ideas, and people had nearly ceased. Communities were isolated, surviving on local resources. After the gap, trade resumed, but it was patchy. Small coastal and riverine networks appeared first, often limited to a few hundred kilometers. Shells, stones, and exotic minerals began moving again, but the scale was nothing like the pre-gap era. Over centuries, trade networks gradually expanded. Cultural exchange, migration, and the flow of ideas resumed, but only slowly, as humans rebuilt trust and infrastructure. Trade didn't just move goods. It rebuilt culture, language, and social networks. It allowed human knowledge to regrow, slowly knitting together the fragmented post-gap world. 4. The birth of early complex societies. From the slow recovery emerged the first complex societies that would define early history. Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, and Anatolia became centers of experimentation in agriculture, governance, and technology. Yet even these societies carried the mark of the 8.2K gap. Population densities remained lower than before the collapse. Cities were smaller and less ambitious. Writing, metalworking, and monumental architecture all appeared incrementally, reflecting knowledge relearned rather than continuously developed. Every innovation was built on fragile memory. Every city was a triumph of caution, patience, and resilience. The survivors had learned that complexity without stability was a risk humanity could not afford. 5. Cultural memory and the rise of myth. Stories became central to survival. Oral traditions preserved knowledge in coded forms. Myths, songs, and rituals carried practical wisdom. Some scholars argue that flood legends, tales of wandering, and stories of hardship in multiple cultures may reflect echoes of the 8.2K event. For example, the Mesopotamian flood myths and the later epics of the Near East may preserve faint traces of a collective memory. The world once fell silent, civilizations vanished, and humanity survived only by endurance. Art and symbolism also reflect recovery. Figurines, pottery, and early temples begin to show the sophistication of culture slowly returning, but always with caution, often simpler than before, and frequently regional rather than universal. 6. Global repercussions. The post-gap world did not look the same as the pre-gap one. Across continents, humans had adapted to new climates, new landscapes, and new social realities. In North Africa, people migrated to river valleys and oases, developing early pastoralist societies. In Europe, small farming communities gradually expanded into low-density settlements that would eventually form the basis of Neolithic Europe. In the Americas, populations shifted to fertile river valleys and coastal plains, setting the stage for the first complex societies. Genetically, humanity had bottlenecks, meaning entire lineages vanished. Linguistically and culturally, connections between regions were broken, forcing isolated communities to rebuild independently. The world had changed, and humans had changed with it. 7 lessons from the 8.2K gap. The story of the 8.2K gap is more than a history lesson. It is a cautionary tale. Humanity is resilient, yes, but also fragile. Civilizations can vanish without warning. Knowledge can be lost. Populations can collapse. From this period, we learn resilience is survival. Small, cautious societies persisted when overextended ones vanished. Knowledge is fragile. Written and oral transmission are critical to maintaining culture. Adaptation matters. Success came from flexibility, not ambition. Recovery is slow. Even after the climate improved, it took centuries to rebuild. Memory shapes culture. Oral traditions, myth, and ritual carry knowledge across gaps in history. The 8.2K gap is a reminder that humanity's progress is never guaranteed. The world can change faster than we think, and survival requires vigilance, ingenuity, and cooperation. In the next part, we will explore the final consequences, how this gap shaped the civilizations that followed, and why the ghosts of these lost societies still influence our world today. The 8.2K gap did not end quietly. Its legacy reverberates through the foundations of every civilization that followed. By the time humans rebuilt cities, developed writing, and invented kingdoms, the world had been fundamentally reshaped geographically, culturally, genetically, and psychologically. To understand this, we must trace the aftershocks that stretched across millennia and see how the silence left by the 8.2K event continues to echo in human history. One civilization's reborn, but different. By 7000, 6000 BCE, new urban centers began to appear in Mesopotamia, along the Nile, and in Anatolia. These early societies, Sumerians, Egyptians, and Hittites among them, were pioneering in agriculture, metallurgy, and governance. Yet their achievements were built on a world that had forgotten its past. The cities that rose after the 8.2K gap were smaller, more cautious, and more localized than the thriving settlements that existed before the gap. Trade and communication slowly returned, but nothing like the pre-gap networks that had spanned continents. Even monumental architecture reflected caution. Walls were defensive, layouts conservative, and urban planning practical rather than ambitious. Humanity had learned a painful lesson. Growth without stability can vanish in a single generation. 2. The shadow of migration. The mass migrations triggered by the 8.2K collapse left deep imprints on human genetics and culture. Populations scattered, interbred, and reassembled in new ways. Modern genetic studies reveal bottlenecks and admixtures that can be traced directly to this era. These migrations also spread survival knowledge. A farming technique lost in one valley could reappear hundreds of miles away. A seed variety forgotten in one region might be preserved elsewhere. But with knowledge scattered, local adaptations dominated over global continuity. In effect, humanity became a patchwork of small experiments, each recovering at its own pace. The long-term consequence: cultural diversity increased dramatically, but coordinated, large-scale civilizations took centuries to reemerge. 3 myths, legends, and the lost memory. The 8.2K gap left few written records, but oral memory survived in shadows. Flood legends, wandering heroes, and lost golden ages appear in multiple early mythologies, Mesopotamian epics, early European tales, and African oral traditions. Though these myths are not direct historical accounts, scholars speculate that they preserve echoes of the global crisis. Floods reflect sudden climatic events or regional catastrophes. Wandering peoples mirror migrations and displacements. Lost cities and vanished kings symbolize the fragility of early complex societies. In every culture, memory of catastrophe was encoded in story rather than fact, a method of survival in a world that could erase knowledge overnight. 4. Technology lost and regained. Archaeology shows that many technologies were reinvented multiple times after the 8.2K event. pottery styles were rediscovered independently in different regions. Metalworking reemerged slowly, sometimes centuries apart. Agricultural practices, irrigation, crop rotation, selective breeding required trial and error to regain. This reinvention cycle shaped human progress. Civilizations became more cautious and incremental in their approach. Failure became a costly lesson written into the collective memory of humanity. The gap left a blueprint. Knowledge is powerful but ephemeral. Protect it, share it, and civilization endures. 5. Environmental adaptation and innovation. Post-gap societies had to adapt to landscapes permanently altered by climate shifts. Rivers had changed course. Coastlines had moved. Deserts expanded. Forests regrew in different patterns. Human ingenuity emerged in response. Canal systems in Mesopotamia allowed agriculture to flourish in newly dry areas. Terraced farming in Anatolia and Europe conserved soil and water. Pastoralism expanded in Africa, creating resilient societies in semi-arid regions. The 8.2K gap forced humans to innovate within limits, laying the foundations for civilizations capable of surviving climatic stress. 6. Political structures and centralization. Interestingly, the 8.2K gap may have influenced how early states organized themselves. Societies emerging from the collapse prioritized local stability over expansion, resource management over conquest, defensive structures over monumental pride. This cautious governance style persisted for centuries. Only after populations stabilized did large empires, like Egypt's Old Kingdom or Mesopotamian city-states, arise. In a sense, the gap created the conditions for more sustainable governance, teaching humans through absence what happens when societies overextend themselves. 7. The psychological legacy. Perhaps the most subtle, yet enduring, impact of the 8.2K gap is psychological. Humanity learned that progress is never guaranteed. Knowledge can vanish. Populations can collapse. Societies can forget. Evidence suggests this awareness influenced religious practices, emphasizing caution, ritual, and respect for forces beyond control. Oral storytelling traditions that emphasized survival and adaptation. Early cultural taboos against overexploitation of resources. Humans began building not just for prosperity, but for resilience, a lesson written in the architecture, laws, and oral traditions of post-gap societies. 8. The ghosts of lost civilizations. Even today, the 8.2K gap leaves traces, archaeological sites that appear abandoned or incomplete, genetic lineages with sudden gaps or bottlenecks, mythologies referencing floods, darkness, or wandering peoples, lost technologies that had to be reinvented. These are the ghosts of civilizations erased, not by war alone, but by environmental catastrophe disease, migration, and the fragility of memory. Every pyramid, temple, and early city that survives is a testament to human resilience, rising from the ashes of a world that nearly forgot how to build. 9 Lessons for the modern world. The 8.2K gap is not just a historical curiosity. It is a mirror. Climate change can destabilize societies faster than anticipated. Knowledge is precious and easily lost. Population disruptions, migration, and pandemics can amplify disasters. Recovery is possible, but slow, uneven, and often incomplete. Understanding the 8.2K gap reminds us that human civilization is not guaranteed, and that resilience, caution, and adaptability are as important today as they were 8,200 years ago. History did not proceed in a straight line. It zigzagged, stalled, and sometimes disappeared altogether. The 8.2K gap is one of the clearest examples. A world frozen in silence, waiting for humanity to rise again. Epilogue, remembering the silence. As we reflect on this lost era, it becomes clear. The 8.2K gap is not just a historical mystery. It is a warning and a guide. It teaches us that civilizations are delicate, memory is fleeting, and survival depends on adaptation. It reminds us that the story of humanity is not just about triumph, but about endurance in the face of silence. And perhaps most hauntingly, even when we rebuild, the ghosts of what was lost linger in soil layers, in myths, in DNA, in the shadows between the chapters of history. The world may change again, and humanity may face another silence. But as long as we remember, learn, and adapt, the story will continue. The 8.2K gap is gone, but its echoes are everywhere. We are walking in the shadows of forgotten civilizations, and every step we take is built on the resilience of those who survived the silence.